Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge. Welcome to this video. Now, a short while ago, a couple of weeks ago, I published a video about the System 100 modules from Behringer. These guys over here in my rack. I had loads and loads of comments left for that video. Thank you very, very much for all your interest, for watching the video and for leaving so many comments. I really do appreciate it. Now, amongst those comments were a number of questions. So what I thought I'd do is do a couple of sort of like follow-up videos, shorter follow-up videos to try and address some of those questions. Now, the subject of this particular video is going to be a prominent question, which was how did I patch that very first sort of like demo that I played. I had lots of positive feedback about that demo. I really do appreciate it. Now, it's very difficult for me to answer how I patched it because, you know, that's the part of the wonder and the mystery and the frustration of Eurorack is it's all completely manual. How you've set the controls, how you've patched it with cables. It's there while you've done it, and as soon as you take that away and patch something else up, you've lost everything. So unless you take some detailed notes about how you patched it and maybe take some photographs as well, it's difficult to recreate a patch. Now, thankfully, I've got the original video footage, so I'm going to show you that original video footage on my PC screen here. And annotate a few different things about it and show you how I basically connected it up together again. But because with that patch I used two little standalone sequencers and I sort of like set the tones and the pitches to ear basically to get something that sounded good, I didn't make a note of what those notes were that I was playing. It would be very, very difficult for me to sort of like go through step by step that video and try and figure out what those notes are. So what I thought I'd do is I'll show you the video, the original video footage. I'll annotate it. I'll talk you through how I patched it in theory. But then what I thought I'd do might be more interesting is to actually do something fairly similar with the modules here in my rack, and actually show you how I'm attempting to sort of integrate Eurorack gear into my normal workflow and my normal recording process and compositional process. Because it's all well and good to have a little standalone set of modules with sequencers and kick them off and create nice little sounds, but then how does that then equate to making music? How do you use it to sort of like integrate with a recording and write a piece of music around it? So I'll kind of get into that a bit towards the end of the video. But first, let's just take a look at the original footage that I shot of that patch, that demo. I'm going to show it to you here in Adobe Premiere Pro, which is the video editing software that I normally use. And that will allow me to annotate it a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just kick it off and play it. Okay, so I spend a lot of my time over here in the top right with this module here. This is actually just a 4-channel stereo mixer. I've got 4 different synth voices playing, and I'm just sort of like turning them up, the gain on them, and introducing them one at a time. So this is the first one, sort of a bass sound. Here comes the second. Playing exactly the same time as the bass, but 1 octave up and not quite the same notes. And here comes the third. And then finally the fourth. So there's 4 notes playing. They're playing in pairs, and they're playing at different speeds or 2 different set speeds. So let's go back to when we just had the first 2 playing on their own. And let's pay attention to this module here. It's a sequencer module, a 182 module. And look at the LEDs as it steps through. it gets to 4, and then back up to 1 again. I basically configured this sequencer as 2 synchronized separate sequences of 4 notes each. And if we look at these 2 grey cables here, these are the CV outs for each of those sequences. They're going all the way down here to this module here, which is a dual VCO 112 module, and they are providing the CV ins, the pitch ins for each of those oscillators. This is the start of 2 of the synth voices. I'll explain the patching of the synth voices in a second. If we go back to the sequencing, so we've got this sequencer at the top, as I said before, 4-note sequence, 2 sequences being played, and we've got another sequencer below it here, and this, as you can see from the LEDs, is playing an 8-note sequence. Get your hand out of the way. Right. And you'll see that as it gets to the bottom of its cycle, to cycle around again, that's the moment when this top sequence moves forward 1 step, advances, get to the bottom, advances. And that's because this sequencer is controlling the top sequencer using its trigger out. This pale white grey cable here, it's coming out of the trigger out of the sequencer at the bottom and into the trigger in of the sequencer above. So 1 complete cycle and it moves forward 1 step. So let's move back to where my hands aren't in the way. Now, like I said in my original video about these sequencer modules, they won't generate a trigger out unless they also receive a trigger in. And I didn't really want to give this a trigger in, the sequencer. I'm quite happy to press its start button and set the tempo manually. That would be fine for this particular patch. But I have to give it a trigger in. And I'm doing that using this LFO here. So you'll see that there's a black cable coming out, CV out of the LFO. It's coming down here and it's going into the trigger in of this sequencer here. So if you pay attention to this little green LED here, which is showing the cycling of the LFO, you'll see that it's matching exactly the tempo. It's driving the tempo of this sequencer, and this sequencer is driving the tempo of the one above. Okay, so let's just have a look at the synth voices. I'll wind back to before I start sticking my hands in the way. Let's just have a look at the top here. You'll see that actually we've got a dual oscillator module, a dual filter module, a dual amplifier module, and then we've got a modulation module with a dual envelope generators. And it's exactly the same at above as it is below. We've got oscillators, filters, amplifiers and envelope generators. One of the really nice things about these System 100 modules is the sort of the clarity of them. So you'll see here that all of the sort of like the modulation patching is at the bottom of the modules, and sort of all of the audio inputs and outputs are towards the top. So it's quite easy to see that here we've got an oscillator. The oscillator audio out is going out and into this filter, and then the audio is coming out of the filter and going into this amplifier, and then with this blue cable the audio is coming out of the amplifier and going into the mixer. It's very, very straightforward, and it's standard with subtractor synthesis. You've got oscillators going into filters, going into amplifiers, and then out. So we've got these 3 daisy chained together, and then we've got the components next to them. We've got this oscillator going into this filter, and then from this filter going into this amplifier, and then from this amplifier out to the mixer. And it's exactly the same at the bottom here, but with red cables this time. Oscillator into filter, filter into amplifier, amplifier out, oscillator into filter, filter into amplifier, and amplifier out. So very, very simple synth voices. But what about modulating them? Well, we've got these two modulator modules, these 140 modules. That gives us 4 envelopes in total. And we've got 4 synth voices, so we can actually only use 1 envelope generator for each synth voice. There's an awful lot of patching that you can do with just 1 envelope generator. Obviously, if it's a bit more complex, then we might need 2 envelope generators. But these patches here, these modules are patched so that 1 single envelope generator is giving an envelope to both the amplitude as well as the filter. So if we look at this envelope here at the top, it's got a red and a black cable coming out of it. The black cable is going into the CV in of the filter, so that's giving me my filter envelope, and the red cable is coming out and going into this amplifier, which is giving me my amplitude envelope. So 1 envelope generator supplying amplitude and filter envelopes, and it's exactly the same with the envelope generators below. The other cables that we've got going on here, which make it a little bit more complicated, is, well, we have to trigger those envelopes. All 4 of those envelopes need to be gated, need to be triggered, and it's our sequencers that are going to be doing that. Now, each sequencer module has got 2 sequences running to 2 different synth voices, but there's just 1 gate out because those sequences are synchronized. Both notes play at exactly the same time, and we have 1 gate out for each of those notes. So what I need to do is take that 1 single gate out, and I have to pass it into a mult. So let's take a look at this bottom sequencer as an example, because it's got a very obvious red cable here. This red cable is the gate out from the sequencer, this braided one. It's going into this mult over here, and then from the mult it's being split out basically into these 2 blue cables, which then are giving me my gate inputs to my 2 envelopes at the top here. And it's exactly the same for this other sequencer. We've got a grey cable giving me the gate out, this one here, it's a bit buried. It's coming over here into this mult, and then we've got these 2 lighter grey cables coming out of the mult, and they're going into both of the envelope generators there. So that is what is giving me my gates to open my envelopes, trigger my envelopes, which basically creates the whole sound. The only other cabling that I've got going on here is, well, we've already talked about this LFO, because this LFO is driving the first sequencer in the chain. But we do have another LFO here at the bottom that's free. So I'm using it to give some modulation to 2 of the synth voices. You can see there's 2 grey cables coming out of this particular LFO. One of those grey cables is this one here. It's going in to modulate the pitch of this oscillator to give it a bit of vibrato, and the other cable is coming out, and you can't really see it, it's hidden here, but it's going into this filter, so it's actually giving a little bit of filter cutoff modulation to another one of the synth voices, just giving a little bit of movement. And that's it, that's all the cables, 4 very simple synth voices being controlled by 2 sequencers. Right, so that was the patch that I did for the original video. Let's talk about my current setup, or the changes that I've made to it. Now, all of my, I was going to say most of my, actually all of my sort of like composition and recording of music takes place in my DAW. I use Cubase, but you know, every DAW is very similar. But I use a DAW, it's kind of central to everything that I currently do. Sometimes I wish that wasn't the case. I wish that I was doing things a little bit more hip and different, but that is the way it is. Now, for me to sort of integrate eurorack into my DAW setup and my recording process, well, the logical thing to do is to use MIDI and to control my eurorack gear with MIDI. So I've made a few changes to this rack setup that I've got here. Whereas before, over here top left, I used to have a Mutable Instruments MIDI to CV converter module. That's now gone, and I've replaced it with a module that's actually off camera. I'll show a close-up of it in a second, by Polyen, the Poly 2. And the reason I've got that module is because, well, it's just absolutely brilliant, actually. It's so highly configurable, and it supports up to 8 8 synchronous channels of MIDI at the same time. So I can be controlling with separate CVing gates 8 different synth engines. It's really, really powerful. So I've got the Poly 2 there in that rack above. Now, in terms of changes here to this particular rack, over on the right hand side, I did have my 4-channel Dope stereo mixer. Since doing the video, I've received one of the sort of the final modules that I had on order, the new ones, and it's this one here at the bottom here. It's the Behringer 305. Now, Roland System 100M does not have a 305 module. What Behringer have basically done is taken 2 System 100M modules and put them together side by side, basically, into one module here and called it a 305. They're basically taking the 174, I believe it is, parametric EQ module, and they've taken the 131 output mixer module, and they put the two together, and if you add up 131 and 174, you get 305, which is how Behringer have decided to name the module, which I think is rather fun. So there it is. It's both of those modules, their circuitry side by side, just in one. It's actually larger than the other modules. They weren't able to cram it into the same size, but it's probably better to have it like this than to have 2 separate modules that would be even wider. And actually, for me, it's very, very convenient because it fits in perfectly aligned. In this case, I can get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 regular size modules plus the 305, and it all fits perfectly, which makes me very, very happy. So that's what I've got here. This is my replacement for the Dope module, 4-channel stereo mixer. It's got some nice sliders, which I like, and it's got the pan controls here for each of the input channels. It's got a parametric EQ, which I'm not using. I can't honestly, with sort of like sawtooths and square waves and low pass filters, I can't really see a desperate need to use a parametric EQ, but it's there if you want it. And what else does this module have? It has, which is really, really handy, it's got a standard oscillator tone, and I use this for tuning. So you can have 220, 440, and 880 hertz. So 3, 4, and 5. To tune against, which is really, really handy because we're dealing with pure analog voltage controlled circuitry. There will be very slight drift over a period of time with any voltage control oscillators you'll find in eurorack, and it's nice to have something to tune them against just right here. And it's got its own little mix level there, so you can mix that sort of test tone in. And as well as that, we've got 2 pairs of stereo outs, different size jacks. We've got a master volume for that, and we've also got an independent headphone output with its own level. So it's a really, really nice, handy to have module to finish things off. And you'll see here with these blue cables, they're all coming in from my 4 amplifiers into the mixer. So in terms of the Synth Voices, this is pretty much exactly the same as in that original video. I'm sort of daisy chaining together oscillator, filter, amplifier, 4 of them, and I'm utilizing the 4 envelopes. So each Synth Voice has one single envelope generator, like before. In terms of modulation, it's very, very slightly different. I'm using both of these LFOs to modulate pitch and give a little bit of vibrato to all of the oscillators, all 4 of them. But how am I sort of like controlling these Synth Voices? Well, that's what's different. I've still got a sequencer module in this rack. The second one was down here. It's now been moved out because I had to rearrange everything. I've decided, because I'm using MIDI, that I'm going to be sequencing in my DAW and not use these little standalone sequences. I don't think that'll always be the case. I think having little standalone sequences is really a nice idea. You can get some really complex modulations out of them, but it's so much simpler and quicker and easier for me to create pitch sequences in my DAW than it is to fiddle around with controls. So I've decided for this particular patch to not use the sequencers for pitch modulation. So that's why you're seeing all of these cables coming out of the Poly End Poly 2. We've got the top 4 cables are gates, and they're all going into the 4 envelope generators, and then the lower 4 cables are all CVs, and they're going into each of the 4 oscillators. So I've got here a very sort of like simple ambient patch. It's not the same as the original one that I played to you. I'll show it to you now in my DAW. Okay, so here in Cubase I have got just 4 tracks here. They're 4 MIDI tracks, as you can see, and each one of them is set up to send its MIDI output to the Poly 2. So I'm connecting to the Poly End Poly 2 using USB. It's all class compliant. It appears magically on my PC as a MIDI interface, and here it is in Cubase. So what I have done, and the way I've configured the Poly End Poly 2, is to be in channel mode basically. So each pair of CV and gates that I want to use are on a different channel. So you'll see here that this first channel, this first MIDI track that's the channel there, is on channel 1, this is on channel 2, this is on channel 3, and this is on channel 4. So we're controlling each of the CV and gates on different channels. And here, all this is just a load of notes that I programmed in. Now, before we go into the sequence that I've got here, I'm going to just talk about this far left-hand side here. I've got the same note that I've copied down onto each of the MIDI tracks, and I've got it here in the key editor. It's just playing an A. And the reason why I've got that is because the one thing you're going to want to do, and it's the same with a fully analog synth, that, certainly with a vintage synth, and it's the same with VCO eurorack gear, is you're going to want to make sure that your oscillators are perfectly in tune when you start recording, and you're recording your tracks. So I want to quickly and easily be able to sort of like forget what I'm doing in terms of my sequence and come back and tune my oscillators. So what I've got here is I've just got an A note that I'm playing, and I just loop it, and I just play that, and it's triggering all 4 of my little synth voices over here at the same time, and you can hear that they are out of tune. Now, the trouble with tuning midway through using a patch is that you're going to have to kind of undo the patch a bit. I'm going to have to turn off, for example, the vibrato that I've got going on, and then I'm going to have to listen to each of the oscillators one at a time. So I'm going to turn on my little test tone, which is my A. Let's turn up the first oscillator. It might well be that I have to undo other parts of the patch as well, but I can just about hear what's going on fine there. So that's that one. So I do it by ear. I find that that's sort of like works best for me. I didn't say it in my original video, but these 112 modules, let's just turn it off. These 112 modules, the pitch is a full 5 octaves in range. It is, and they're bigger knobs than these tiny little ones that you get on the sequencer, but still, it is, to get exact tuning, it takes a bit of practice because you're talking about the tiniest of movements with your fingers to get the right pitch. So now, if I play them all together, they're in tune. Very, very slight undulations going on there, but that sounds nice. That's analog for you. So that's what I do is I have this little sort of like section always handy at the beginning of my sequence so that I can tune. But then actually the real sequence is this whole section here. And basically all I've got, similar to how I programmed those two separate sequences, those 4 sequences in that original patch, I'm just playing single notes, and I picked out notes that kind of work well together, like that. Now the original patch was very regimented and very sort of like, you had 8 steps and 4 steps. It was very sort of like a regimented rhythm to it. This one isn't the same. I'm kind of mixing this up a bit. I'm having the 2 notes here play at the same time, and the 2 notes here play at the same time. So similar to that first patch in some ways, but then I'm actually starting to mix it up a bit. And by the time we get towards the end, the notes are all triggering at slightly different times.